Right, this is going to be another episode of ReScope here with me and Paladin. So if people don't know, the premise of this show that differentiates it from other talk shows is we actually intentionally, a la the name of the show, try to sort of like take a different, larger scale framing typically of things that are going on in esports, because obviously most esports things is like day-to-day content, whereas even though, to be fair, CSGO has been fairly reflective at the end of CSGO, obviously when people do all the lists and stuff. In general, the point of this podcast is we try to look at the bigger historical framing. So what we do is, normally it's 3, but we each come with a number of topics. We do show each other the topics before, because some of them actually essentially are like homework. You have to actually think through what your answer is going to be. And then what we do is we just put one to each other and then just bounce ideas off each other. So what is the first one, Paladin, you have chosen? By the way, for those unaware, he has a new Twitter now reflecting that he is in CS2. Obviously not dat Paladin or whatever. The problem with that one wasn't the lack of CSGO, it was the dat part. That's like, that ass was a meme about 15 years ago or something. That's actually, I know. That's boomer at this point in time, you know.
I made it like maybe when I was a teenager. I never changed it, and so it just kind of stuck. And then by the time everything started rolling, I was like, I can't change it now. People are not going to know who I am anymore. But I think I've gotten to a point where I can finally change it. Well, I guess we could start to.
By the way, as an aside, didn't you just do an event recently? You did like what? Did you do a Thunderpick or something?
Thunderpick.
An event? Right? Yeah, there we go. Okay.
Yeah, I was on the desk there, so. Looking forward to getting back into the swing of things.
Hit me with it. What's the first topic?
So I think in lieu of what's going on with FaZe right now, of course their win streak is just broken, but it was still a very impressive one. We're going to talk about it at quite length throughout this episode, but I think I'd like to look back into a very similar vein where, you know, teams kind of fall apart, and, you know, you can definitely see the mistakes in these teams, and you can see that there's clearly an upside to maybe rebuilding a team, but when those reports come out and the status of a team's success kind of changes and how they approach things changes, you think that maybe they're down and out and you kind of write them off. There are a lot of different teams, a lot of different organizations that have gone through different changes, and right before the change, when you know the change is coming, you kind of write them off. They don't actually succeed very well. They usually come out in last place, second to last place, and you kind of say, okay, it's fine, you know, better change is coming, it's all good. But I think there's a lot of teams where, or not a lot of teams, I'd say there's probably a hand select few that break the trend and actually surprise, and even with all the pressure off of them, they somehow turn up at the biggest moments and find a way to win. And I guess the question that I would basically pose is, what are some of the greatest last wins in Counter-Strike? So I guess, for example, FaZe right now, we knew that Twist is probably out the door, rumblings of other players potentially leaving as well, and yet still they were able to amass a big win streak. So what do you think basically poses as one of the greatest last wins at CS?
Right, obviously, the tricky thing about this framing is, like you said in your setup there, that what makes it a bit more complicated is we're not really just doing ones where it's like, I get the idea, correct me if I'm wrong, the idea of the framing here is more like either the FaZe Clan one, where it's like, look, the team it's inevitable, we have to split up. Because if people don't know, I mean, you'll have seen today, this news came out, like, sort of further cemented. But as far as I know, actually all those Liquid moves you've heard are all happening. All of them, like Skulls and Twists and KD. As far as I know, that actually is one of the rare times in the offseason where all those leaks were true and they're all going to happen. It's just, in this case, I'm sure it was things like people had to attend the final lands and the contract negotiation, all that. But as far as I know, it is happening. So basically, as far as I know, at a minimum, Twists is leaving FaZe. And then obviously there's the whole separate thing, if people don't know, where since maybe the Game Square people or whatever are acquiring the FaZe brand, but then they're the people who also own Complexity, basically one of the lineups is going to have to disappear, and it's implied it's the FaZe one. So maybe the rest of the core gets sold, or maybe they break up and all go one to each team. Who knows, right? At the moment, no one knows on the FaZe side, but we do know the Liquid one. So we do know FaZe will change. So either there's that one. They didn't obviously, essentially, as far as we know, sort of choose. Like, I guess Twists did, but to be fair, they did the win streak after he'd chosen, if no people know what I mean. But I'm guessing most of the time you mean more like where essentially a lineup is dead, as in we know it's going to change, and it's more like the players, like, you know, let's say you have like 2 more obligations, you have like an ESL event or a blast or something, you go to it, but like you're saying, everyone knows, including the players, it's dead, and that's why actually normally the expectation is, even if they come last place, you don't mind, right? Because it's like, well, you know, the lineup's breaking up. So obviously there's not actually going to be that many that are obvious for this one, because usually either people, here's what's funny, the real irony is you might actually have some examples at me straight fire from my content that I don't even remember, because it's the sort of thing that people mention in like a reflections type interview, but years after the fact, isn't it? Like, I knew the team was dead or whatever. So I've got a few, but believe it or not, I actually don't have many that are that great. Like, believe it or not, I couldn't really think of any from like CS 1.6, for example. So I've got a few from CSGO that people might know. So one, I'm going to use quite an actual recent one just to jog people's memory. So this might shock you, but guys, we all knew that story that Fallen was going to go to Furia before that last spring, where, if people forget, dude, Imperial did make top 4 that. They were like 2 rounds from being in the finals. Everyone forget that. Like, they beat Vitality there, and then they almost beat bloody Heroic, if you remember, who won the event. Like, even though the joke is, I never thought that lineup was good, and I actually think they were actually gassed up on that performance. I can't lie. Like, that team went from being completely irrelevant at tier 1 to almost beating the top 2 teams in the world and winning like an event on the way out the door. Like, even though they didn't quite do it, like, that was actually quite impressive. Like, I couldn't even believe that they pulled out of nowhere. The joke is that actually got me hyped up that Fall would be good in Furia, and that's obviously not worked out, has it? So there's like a smaller one, but I thought more recently. And then if we sort of go back, I'll go back in more recent times, so you can worry about the other ones later. Then, if you remember, there was that bizarre scenario also with the Brazilians, where at the Boston Major that was won by Cloud9, remember, they had to use Phelps because of the roster eligibility, but at the time they'd been using Bolts already. They'd already made him in the lineup, so Phelps came back in as a stand-in, and people forget this. Dude, they were in the semi-finals. It was 3 maps against Cloud9. Like, there's a real world, by the way, where if they won that one, who knows what happens in the final? They might have won that major. Like, they almost really did fuck around and win a major with like a dead lineup. That, by the way, if you remember, that one I particularly picked because they not only did a very good run at the major. If you remember, though, they even said before, as mad as this sounds, that was when that whole hype started of like, maybe the majors don't matter that much. Because if you remember, they actually said, we're not even going to practice with Phelps for the major. In fact, we're going to bring Bolts with us and keep practicing, because even though this didn't happen, fans, they thought, well, as soon as this major's over, Bolts are coming and we'll just win everything. Whereas obviously the irony is after that, they never actually made it back again with the Bolts lineup. If you remember, they sort of fell downhill, and that's when they went and did that like attempted simple flamey lineup, and then a couple of other ones are smaller ones. So this one's a bit more tenuous. That's why I set it up like this one's a little bit more tenuous, but the last one's a real example, which is when they made that second French shuffle and Apex and Kenny S came over to Envious. I've had the story told many times on the reflections, so it's just not quite the same, but basically the story goes that in the boot camp for Cluj-Napoca, the major they won, essentially they were going to fail the major and split the team up afterwards. Like, they actually decided, believe it or not, it didn't work, even though they had all the amazing success at tournaments like top placings and even won some events, because the logic was they were just so bad in scrims and they were having like issues with certain players. And so they actually thought, essentially, let's just scrap the boot camp because we're going to sort of get on each other's nerves. Let's just go to the major, do what we can, then we'll figure it out afterwards. And it just so happened they really did trip over, fuck around and win a major, which shouldn't be possible. I know that sounds so ridiculous, but in some ways, by the way, that is also the most fitting French major they could ever win if you know how the French scene was. So the last one is a really old school CSGO one, but this one actually is more in the first category that actually counts, which is way back in the day, before they made the Complexity / Cloud9 team with Hiko and Semphis and all the rest. People might not know this, but Hiko and Semphis used to actually play with Dazed, and they played in a team called Quantic, and the same thing happened. It was a team that had like TCK, and I think Frost was the AWPer, and it was like a bit of Source and a couple of CS players. And what happened was this team, because of people like Semphis and Dazed, and who just, you can imagine, like, they're pretty spicy people as it is, so people like that don't get along, and it's almost inevitable you're going to have fallout. So what happened was they'd already decided, basically, like, fuck you, right, well, after these lands then, this last trip to Europe, fuck you, I'm leaving. And then they did, no joke, Paladin, if you ever go and look, their last 2 lands was like Copenhagen Games, where they come something mad, like 3rd or 4th, and I think even beat like Very Games, who was like number 2 team in the world. And then they go to ESEL and do the same thing. I think they came 2nd or something, and then right after that, because they already knew before this land, even though they come 2nd, like, essentially only NIP, the team that at the time has only ever lost once, the only team that can beat them, and they still broke the team up, because it was, like I'm saying, it was where it even if you'd won those events, you basically have just said, I hate you, fuck you, when I'm leaving, and then you just play the tournament. But I think that's, in some ways, even though that's the least famous one, it's the ultimate example of it, because actually what you're getting to here, as a quick aside, is obviously there is some sort of weird psychological phenomena that seems to manifest here, where when you sort of it sort of seems to remove all the pressure and the expectation that since you know no matter what, this lineup won't exist, it then allows people to somehow play like free, which sounds counterintuitive because you'd think when you all want to play together and you all have money in your charisma, you'd think that'd be when you'd play your best, but it just shows how weird the human mind is. So come on, hit me with some of yours. What were you thinking of?
I think so. I like to think about Berlin as my best example with ENCE, where there was already news in the camp saying that Twista came out and said basically that Sunny is coming in for Alexi B. This lineup is dead, and we're just going to play out this event and see what happens. And I think it was just incredible to me that they not only just dominated within that legend stage, but they beat Vitality as well to get to that spot in the quarterfinals. And that Vitality team was second in the world at that point in time going in. They were the ones that were actually battling against Liquid and pulled them to a close series. But I think it was most bizarre to me to see that Alexi B had suddenly turned a new leaf and he was fragging. He had so much impact in that tournament. And it felt as though all of the issues that ENCE had been having for such a long period of time had just quickly vanished. Beyond Katowice, it felt as though there wasn't really a player that could show up on that team. You had occasional pop-up performances from an Alu, from maybe a Sergey here or there, but it was never something that was definite. And yet somehow everything just came into place for them. And even against Renegades, I honestly favored them in that matchup, but obviously Renegades just had a very good meeting of the minds at that point. Everything came together and they got that semifinal berth. And mind you, I think actually I forgot to mention that in that Swiss stage, they also beat Avantgarde in the best of one, which of course went out to be the finalists. So a big, like legitimate run to that playoff stage. So that was obviously the biggest one for me. Another one in terms of Vitality, you could go back to when they were about to, when the international announcement had come to be, where Dupree and Magus and Zonic were all coming in. They still had that French lineup, and they
end of 2021.
Yes, I believe that was the world final there, where at this point, there's still a number 2 team in the world, number 2, 3 in the world, and it didn't necessarily feel like they were ever going to hit a ceiling. It definitely felt like Kyojin was out the door. It didn't feel like Masuta was necessarily consistent enough. I think Shox was having a very inconsistent time, and so the moves made sense on paper, but still, Vitality persevered. They made a run all the way to the finals. Of course, nobody could touch Na'Vi at that point, but the fact that they made it to that point with a very dead roster, I think there were a lot of really big emotions at the end of that run as well, where famously when they went behind the stage after the world final was over, and you could see that they were all crying backstage because the lineup was breaking up, and people were all calling for the lineup to continue on moving into the following year. But like we've said, and a very similar point across all of these lineups were doomed to fail, and there was not necessarily going to be another high note that they could definitely achieve in a future event, because the reason why the moves were happening in the first place were there was a fatal flaw in all of these lineups that meant that they couldn't actually lift the trophy, and that was the biggest thing. Is even with all that pressure off, they still weren't able to lift the trophy, and that was the biggest issue for all these teams. But it was still impressive nonetheless. And then the last one that I have is it's a little unorthodox, but to me it was not necessarily the last event for Virtus.Pro, but it was one of the last good events from Virtus.Pro, and I'm talking the original 5 Polish players, where at Epicenter they had this incredible run in honestly a very stacked tournament, all things said. They were actually stuck in the harder group. They had SK, number 1 team in the world, and number 2, 3 team in the world. They had FaZe in their group as well. They managed to eke out the final group placing after beating them in a long best of 3. And going into the playoffs, they have to beat G2, and then they have one of the best of 5 finals I can think of against SK, just back and forth. And honestly, SK were slowly starting to wane at this point, and yet you kind of had the peaks of both of the lineup's powers, where coldzera was going back into MVP form. He eventually goes on to win the MVP for that tournament, but every single player on Virtus.Pro felt reignited. And honestly, I thought the final was ripe for the taking. They were poised to potentially lift the trophy there. And then after that, of course, the lineup falls apart. They go to a number of events, bomb out in last place, and they go to the following major after that with Mihu. But to me, that was kind of like the best moment to describe Virtus.Pro, where there was a team that no matter what the situation was, they wouldn't give up. Even when the odds were stacked against them, they still found a way to win. And yeah, it pretty much sums up kind of the biggest ones that I picked out. But at the end of the day, it does definitely feel as though that Virtus.Pro was kind of like the one that sticks out to me the most, just because of how terrible that roster was going into that event as well. People thought that they didn't even deserve the invite to get there in the first place, but they proved everyone wrong.
Yeah, I will also say as well, the reason why for me there is actually at this point in time a fairly established phenomenon like I described, where once the teams sort of know there isn't any pressure, they tend to just play way better. Sometimes, like we're describing, sometimes they almost play to like the peak of the lineup's ability. The problem is though, the reason why I think that is a real thing is because in the rare instances where people have either like a year later gone, maybe we should get that lineup back together, or they just actually, sometimes on rare occasions, people actually, it did give the lineup extra time because you did well at an event. All I'll tell you is, I mean, ENVE's the best example. They kept the lineup together, they won the major, and they just gradually fell off, and within something like 3 months, they were completely irrelevant. If you remember the next major, they finished in last place. Like, the real problem is, though, this is why I say it is a weird phenomenon, because it's not really that, like, oh, we just misjudged this. Actually, this lineup's straight fire, we should keep it. It tends to be, if you just keep the lineup, obviously there's phase one withstanding, because it's not really their choice necessarily to break it up. Normally, I actually think it is still right, even if you have the results, though, to break the lineup up. Like, essentially, you have to, like, exploit the fucking phenomenon, but it doesn't work forever. It's like the honeymoon period concept. Like, you can't really just break the team up, then put it back together and have another honeymoon a million times over. That doesn't work, does it? Like, you have to sort of do it legit and just have it happen in the normal, natural way. And then after that, once you window of the honeymoon period is over, it's over. In the same way, I think at the end, when you get, like you say, the way you phrase it's quite well, like a second wind or a last wind. Once you've had it, though, you really have had it. Like, that's it. It's over that. But you can't just keep running it back infinitely. So, okay, then, come on then. I'll swap it up then. So I thought one thing that would be fun was take some moves now and then, like the show concept, try and really zoom out on like what would the big picture concept be. So I thought what we'd do is this. As of right now, today is actually the day when I'm recording this, when it was announced, the move that I suggested a lot of people did, just because on paper it feels like an obvious one, which is people will know that Gla1ve was completely obviously no longer in Astralis. He isn't just benched. They had no plans to bring him back. And then obviously Snappy has gone to the Falcons team, in theory, hasn't been like officially announced yet, I guess. And so basically, Gla1ve comes into ENCE to replace Snappy, and he will be the in-game leader going forwards. And then also technically Cuban comes in as the coach, but obviously people are mainly interested in this Gla1ve angle. So the question goes, and I phrase this very carefully, how much of his legacy is Gla1ve risking by taking this gig at ENCE? What do you think?
It's just, I mean, I'm so excited that you posed this question, because there's so many different routes that we can take it. And I guess the first kind of perspective that I look at is essentially, what is the obvious comparison that people make is between Gla1ve and Kerrigan to be the #1 IGL in the world, or of all time, and they both have very interesting strengths, very different strengths in comparison to one another. Kerrigan, on one hand, lifting a number of trophies and finally lifting the coveted major with an international roster and with players with bigger egos, arguably, superstars in their own right, having to assemble these rosters that in theory should be able to win championships, but for whatever reason, without him, we're not able to actually lift the trophies. But when he was able to actually assemble them, he was able to create quite a name for himself. And of course, towards the end of his, or I'm not going to say end of his career, but more towards the current day of play, Kerrigan is still able to win so many more titles and assemble just a fantastic legacy for himself within that FaZe organization. But you look at Astralis and Gla1ve, and already, right after the 4 majors that they lifted and ending at 2019, there was a number of years where it didn't feel like you ever had the Gla1ve of old, and that his form and his style had kind of become outdated, and people had found a way to reinvent the wheel beyond it. So you look at 2020, they were still able to win some trophies there. They were still managing to stay relevant. But then after 2021 rolled around, it definitely started to feel like this team was losing its luster. You look at Stockholm, where they were barely eking their way into the main stage altogether. Then in Antwerp, they had a very ugly appearance there. And then not being able to qualify for any of the subsequent majors after that was very appalling. And granted, they didn't have the best pieces to speak of, but you still had Gla1ve, you still had Device, you still had some great pieces to potentially at least get you into major contention. And the fact that they weren't able to do that already screams to me that these last couple of years that Gla1ve was able to have on Astralis was not good. It was quite miserable even, but people, when they make the comparison between the two IGLs, don't really factor that into the conversation. And I think that's fine. I mean, of course, the majority of the time, Gla1ve was creating quite a resume for himself, and rightfully so, right? Winning those 4 majors in every situation that they were in were all different ones, and they were still able to overcome it with the same core. So to me, I can kind of overlook the aspect of Astralis failing for the last couple of years, because you look at all these GOAT contenders in maybe something like basketball. You think about Michael Jordan. Nobody really talks about the Wizard seasons that he has all too much, because at the end of the day, he's still done so much across his time on the Bulls that it feels as though you can kind of look past the stuff that he did on the Wizards. It's okay. You can kind of ignore it and blot it out of your memory. And I think that's fine. I think you can apply the same situation to Gla1ve here. That being said, now you're braving a frontier that people have already overcome. You look at Snappy, that's already done it with this core. You look at Kerrigan, who's obviously done it with FaZe. And you can start to go down the row of the various IGLs that have already accomplished a lot with international rosters. Of course, Apex comes to mind more recently, of course. And that's when you start to beg the question, is it worth it for Gla1ve to take this kind of a risk at this point in his career? Because now you're coming off of a slump of 2 to 3 years, and now you're asking for yourself, now I have to stack up against more proven IGLs, and I have to do it with a roster that has already been known to win. I mean, or at least get close to win. You're kind of looking to cement yourself as a top 1 team. That's the kind of move that that you're expecting if you're not to an ENCE when you assemble this move. But the fact is that if he fails here, it's a huge stain on his career, in my opinion, because now you have a very clear comparison that you can make between Kerrigan, that you can make between, of course, Apex, as I mentioned, and Snappy, and you weren't able to do it. You weren't able to do it with a fantastic Opper in Sun Pius. You weren't able to do it with some fantastic rifling in Nerds, in Madden and Diha, one of the best supportive-esque players that we have in Counter-Strike right now. If you're not able to win with these pieces, it's very worrying, because now it really just says, hey, now it begs the question, hey, was that original Astralis core, was it just a lightning in a bottle situation? Were they able to hold on to it for as long as possible? Or was it just a flash in the pan? Was it actually legitimate, or was it a flash in the pan? And you're going to start asking that question a lot more if this doesn't work out. So to me, I think this is a huge risk for him. Granted, the upside for this could just cement him in the top 1 conversation altogether if he's able to turn this around. But to me, I think he's putting a lot on the line for this move entirely.
Here's what's funny is, not only did I think this would be a great open-ended question where there was a lot like you could go into there, but I also do think that this is actually a question where people are going to think I've sort of like rules lawyered it and I'm cheating a bit. But this is actually the point I was making by framing it that way. Because obviously when I say like how much of his legacy will it affect, obviously the question is to who, right? That's the issue. To me and you, I actually think you nailed it there. Like to me and you, it won't actually probably affect anything. Like here's the thing. I think if you're being real, if you look currently before Gla1ve has an international lineup and has any success or failure, as of right this moment, a lot of people still do have Gla1ve as the greatest in-game leader ever. Like, even the ones who have Kerrigan, it's nothing to do with what Gla1ve didn't do since the Astralis period, it's what Kerrigan did do. So I will say, look, there is a world in which you could make the argument. I don't really know that it actually is the case yet, though, because you have to remember, if you win 4 majors, to the casual fan, that always is going to be one of the best possible arguments you can ever give, is this guy won 4 and the other one has 1. So even if Kerrigan wins like another major, I think unless he win, here's the thing. I've always said I think 2 with the international, you could make the arguments like 4 with the domestic team, but to a casual fan, probably still not. He probably still needs to get to like maybe 3 or win more or get like another Grand Slam. You know, all these other things you could do. So I do think overall, right, in theory, this doesn't affect it. Like you could make an argument that like Gla1ve actually, as you're saying, is only gambling at this point in time, because actually if he just sits on what he currently has, you can actually make the argument that's probably better for his legacy. Like essentially don't risk anything else. Just sit with that. You've got the 4 majors, a Grand Slam, all those titles. You've got basically everyone agrees you had the best team ever in CS. By the way, probably just in CS in general, if you can ask like general fans. And so right now, you could just sit on that if you're Gla1ve, and then if you never play another second of Counter-Strike, there are so many arguments your fans can make. Because here's the problem. In that scenario, it actually doesn't matter if someone says to Gla1ve, like, but you didn't do it with the national team. As of right this moment, you could always just do the opposite if you're a Gla1ve fan. You could go, well, then why didn't Carrigan, if it's easier to play with domestic players, why didn't he just make a Danish team? You know, why didn't he have Magisk and Config and the other Danes? And why didn't he try to win 5 majors? You could always make that argument right now. But the problem is this, Paladin. Not if Gla1ve himself gambles and goes international. And also, you notice that argument doesn't work anymore because everyone now understands CS in general has become international. So it's no longer the case that people think either. I think the reason people were unkind to Carrigan with the first phase is because at the end of the first phase, the names were too good. So at that time, people didn't give him the leeway of like, you're playing an international lineup. They were like, bro, you have like all the top 20 players. You should win. The difference is, in the modern day, there's not many international teams that are even like that. Teams in general are just international. So first of all, everyone's accepted now. They understand because of Zonic and Vitality, it's harder and it's still its own feat. But they also acknowledge like a lot of people are going to work with international teams now. So I do think actually that if you're going to keep playing, if you're Gla1ve, the joke is now it's the opposite dynamic. Now, if you stayed with all the Danes, everyone would give you the excuse, Paladin. They'd go, well, there's not that many good Danish players, though. Like, what's Astralis going to do? I don't judge. But the joke is, if you walk into ENCE, this is the point I'm going to make that no one's made, is, dude, Gla1ve might be about to fucking Gla1ve himself. People haven't thought this one through. You know how I always make that point? That it's a bit unfair to act like Gla1ve walked in and found Device, Zipnix, Dupree just sitting there and went, you guys, let's just play some CS. Bish, bash, bosh, what's that? We've won the major. It's like, you can't ignore that they did play for years and under another very good IGL, and presumably he got them through certain experiences, and then Gla1ve took over almost at the perfect time. Like, you know how I always say, for me, if anyone's an IGL at the moment in CS, if you look at Huxley's job, what you say if you're an IGL is, just give me his team. Like, basically, just replace me for him. I'll take everything as is and give me that lineup with JKS and Hunter. Like, essentially, everyone thinks that would win. For me, that's what Gla1ve walked into with Astralis. Like, they hadn't won, but man, if you were going to say on paper what team has the potential to do it, they would have been top 3 easily for everyone. So I do. So here's the interesting detail, though, Paladin. If this was just if he'd joined Mouse, no one would blame Gla1ve if he didn't win. But you've nailed it there. Because Snappy, a la Carrigan, had this team this close from winning everything. They could even have won the major. They're this close to all these finals. Now Gla1ve, by the way, almost has to win. He's actually set himself up. Now, here's the thing. On the one hand, that's a good end to the gamble because he actually now could win. By the way, if he wins, I actually don't think it's as enormous as if Carrigan doesn't win and Gla1ve sits on the 4 majors. If he wins, obviously, he can then put himself further ahead to some people. By the way, he can undercut Carrigan's narrative. If Gla1ve has 4 majors, plus then wins tournaments, and by the way, God forbid, wins a major in an international team, suddenly he's undercut that whole argument, hasn't he? So there is something to be gained. I'll just say, I do think that's incredibly hard, though. So I think essentially the gamble is quite well weighted. But I would just phrase it this way. I don't think it actually does affect his legacy at all. I think essentially, if you just look at the years when he was in Astralis, you can just take that time window and say, take your guys, if it's Carrigan, if it's Zeus, if it's whoever, take your guys' window and then let's compare who was the best. And his can always stand like that, like a masterpiece, and people can say he was the greatest ever. But I do actually think if we're talking about legacy in the community and with fans, dude, I do think actually it will matter. Like, what's funny is when you use the example there, I was going to use this exact example, but I'm going to use it in reverse, Paladin, which is Michael Jordan on the Wizards. Because here's what's funny, mate. It's only now, years later, a la this question, that people do finally go, who really cares about the Wizards period? Like, actually, by the way, it's slightly underrated. If you ever go and look how old he is now injured, he's actually pretty good at that point in time. It's just the problem is he isn't Michael Jordan. He's not Superman anymore. He's not the guy who's going to win every game and drop 40 points or whatever. He's not that player. And I can tell you, by the way, when you were really close to that time period, dude, everyone was saying it ruined his legacy. I didn't think that because I've always had sort of a more historical perspective. But at the time, the casual fan essentially was always saying, like, he shouldn't have done it, and they all wanted him to retire on that last shot in Game 6 against the Jazz, because to them, that's like the ultimate end to the movie, isn't it? And so I do think, actually, to casual fans, for a solid, like, 10 years after that, they did think sort of that had ruined him, because you know that whole famous cliche of, like, you're only as good as your last game? They were sort of applying that. Like, their problem was this. If Michael Jordan walked away after he hit that shot against the Jazz, it isn't that you really know he would stay at that level, but because he wouldn't have played again, your brain could go, would he ever have gotten bad? How long could he have kept going? Could they have done another Last Dance? Wow, maybe he would have just never gotten back. You could think all these crazy ideas if you're like a really casual fan. But the problem is you can't think those anymore, because you saw that he did come back and it wasn't as good, and he was older and he was mortal and he lost. I'll give you another example. If anyone's an old school UFC fan, you will know that before Anderson Silva lost to Chris Weidman and lost his title belt, loads of people had him as the GOAT, by the way. Now everyone says John Jones or GSP or Fade or whatever. Loads of people said Anderson Silva. And the reason why, Paladin, is because at the time, because you'd essentially never seen someone just straight up in his prime beat him, it felt like he was unbeatable. In your brain, he not only felt super dangerous, but it also felt like you couldn't even sort of conceive how someone would beat him. Never mind that he would lose. But then somehow when they do lose, even though your brain must know before, like I'm sort of like only seeing the best part of them, I haven't seen the totality of who they are. Somehow when they lose, and the reason I give the Anderson Silva example is if people don't know, essentially after he'd finished being a champion, he just stuck around for 10 more years in the UFC and did sort of like fun fights. He just did like exhibition fights or fights with people he respected, and he didn't even try to be a champion anymore. He didn't have the killer instinct. He was actually, and by the way, I think that's why, again, I wouldn't, I just did a video where I put him as one of the 4 best fighters of all time. But I do think to a casual fan, if they remember all these fights he's had where he wasn't super competitive, he wasn't the best, that does sort of take away from the mistake, as it were. Like if I'm asking you who the best fighter ever is, they're going to think of his recent fights and go, nah, maybe not him. Whereas I do think if he'd also retired before the Chris Weidman fight I just gave the example of, I think people would again, you'd appear bulletproof in memory, as it were. You would seem like you never could have lost. So I actually do low key. I'm on both sides of this. I actually think if people are sensible and they're doing what we're doing, I think ultimately it won't affect his legacy. It can only actually, the good thing is, to me, he can only gamble and gain from this, really. But I do think if you talk about casual fans, like if we want to look at like a HLTV debate in 3 years, Paladin, this could actually fuck everything if you Gla1ve. Like, think about it. He now can't, because here's the problem. The angle you could do if you were a Gla1ve fan that was a really powerful position in an argument went like this. Not only did my guy win 4 majors, your guy didn't, and you're essentially relying on, yeah, but what if? But even better, if you say to me, yeah, but your guy wouldn't have done it with international teams, like, but he never did, so we'll never know. Maybe he would have done it, though. The problem is, after ENCE, he ain't going to be able to say that. And to tie it back in, he now definitely won't be able to say it, because as we pointed out, dude, he actually has a team that's ready to win. He's walking in and he's getting handed a la Gla1ve to Carrigan from TSM. He's getting thrown the keys to a Lambo. Now it's on him. Can he drive it? I'll just throw it as an aside. I will just say it's not as simple as that, though. Like, even though we're all hyping it like that, and all of my boys who love this topic like Vu, we're all saying it, we're mainly being facetious. Like, Gla1ve could actually fail with ENCE, and it might just be the wrong set of personnel, or the wrong, maybe it only works in Danish or whatever. Like, the point is, he could still be the best IGL and fail in this team. But I do think, as you can see, there's so much in this topic. It's a lot more complicated than it initially seems when you put the question out there, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the debate, the HLTV debate, it's a good one, because I think initially the community is already, I mean, from what I've been able to gather, people are honestly not even very happy about it.
Yes.
I've seen a lot of people that are already very negative about it, that don't believe in this working, that he's washed,
yes,
that he has no capability of doing it. But again, you have to take a look at the kind of work that he's put forward, and you have to understand, if you're ENCE's management right now, where do you even go towards if you have to take a risk? Because now you're at a very pivotal point in your organization. You could potentially go the route of a heroic, where you lose Cadian and everything just falls apart at the seams and everything becomes just very meh. Or you could potentially go a different route and basically blaze a new trail where a new IGL comes through, and it could be everything that you could ever ask for, and you could start to win everything. So the decision to actually take an IGL at this point is so important. And you look at the list of people that you could potentially pick up. Do you really want to lead these players with a younger IGL or an unproven IGL or somebody from tier 2? Probably not, because you know that there's a certain type of person that Snappy is, and that these players look up to and have played around with for so long. And you've got to get a very similar person that has seen a lot of Counter-Strike in their time, has played a lot of Counter-Strike, and most importantly, I think for ENCE especially, has actually won a lot. And in comparison to Snappy, Gla1ve has done all of the winning for a long period of time. So in ENCE's organizational perspective, this move just makes sense for them, because it's a risk. Sure, you can take maybe 6 months. You can possibly just take this all the way to the major, see what happens, and then make a judgment call from there. But I mean, I don't necessarily see a downside for them as well, because I don't think necessarily mechanically these players have ever dropped off when they've moved over to CS2. And Pies is still performing very well in playoff situations. So all of the win conditions are still there. It's just a question of, can you still have and maintain that same style, or can you pave and create a new style that you pioneered on Astralis that you could try to develop here on ENCE. But I think a big issue for me is just that, what is a style now that he's taken a break for 1 year or 6 months or something like that? Like, is it actually going to work out in this situation? Because karrigan, I feel, has been able to chop and change his style across his career, and he's finally figured out what the idea of his perfect Counter-Strike is, and it works so well, and he can play it in and out. He can make that round 24 or round 30 call no matter what the situation is, and it always works out. Whereas Gla1ve style, you could definitely feel as though it was running towards that last dance, and it just didn't necessarily feel as though it worked anymore. Those crazy like round 28, 29 executes that they had on maps like Inferno just didn't really hit the same anymore. Their nuke kind of fell apart. They didn't necessarily seem like the same dominant team that they were on a map like Train, for example. So I feel as though Gla1ve has a lot to do in terms of his legacy, in terms of the calling. He's going to have to completely reinvent himself as a caller altogether, especially with the roster that he's been given. Because I'll be honest, I don't necessarily feel as though you can go 1-to-1 with the Astralis members and ENCE's members and say these are very similar players to potentially win with. I mean, playing with Modern is very different from playing with somebody like a Magisk or a Zipnix, or a Dupree, for example. These players are way more aggressive than they are. The game is way pacier than it was before, especially in CS2. Defaults are so much faster. The game is just faster tempo because of the less rounds. It's just going to be a huge learning curve for Gla1ve. So there's a lot that I feel like he's going to have to risk here in terms of trying to adapt to a new game. But as you said, I think the upside for it could be insane, because at that point, I think even if he just wins a couple tournaments, I think already you can start to widen that gap between him and karrigan pretty easily. Just because the big thing that karrigan is making ground over Gla1ve is not necessarily the tournament wins, because it's obviously less. It's just the fact that he was able to do it with an international roster, to do it with players that were, again, as you said, top 20 players on HLTV were expected to win but weren't able to. And now that you look at it, after Vitality having struggled for so much time with a potentially fantastic era-defining roster and not being able to win, you realize that karrigan's ability to deal with all of these players and all of these stars was actually very exceptional. And so you start to realize, karrigan was really, really the shit for so long because he was just very good at what he did. But now, if Gla1ve is able to win in that same fashion, things get very, very different very quickly. And to me, I think that's when I moved Gla1ve back into that conversation at the top, just because he was able to do it and basically answer that what if.
Also, I will say I actually definitely echo the sentiment. The other reason why I think the upside, if it works for Gla1ve on any level, even by the way, just making some finals would obviously go a long way to what you're saying, like showing he can do it without the Danes, it is almost certain, if you just think of like recent narratives, that he can't just come in and literally blow off the dust off ye old Astralis strat book and go turn to page 17 like Blade and start reading the strat. Like, that obviously doesn't work. Like, to me, the best example is what Zonic's just done. The fact that Zonic had 2 fucking Astralis players, and he is the coach of Astralis, and even he couldn't make that style work in an international team, implies you're going to have to. So the upside is, if he does win, a la karrigan, he will have had to reinvent himself for the personnel, so that'll be a very big positive. And then the other thing I'll say is this, like I just touched on there though, the other 2 people people that are in this convo, even though technically they're not directly in this convo, are fucking Zonic and Snappy. Because I'll tell you what, I already think Zonic going and doing a Carrigan without Gla1ve changed how people see Zonic, mate. I actually do think that made the match. By the way, I actually think low-key, Carrigan winning the Major and the Grand Slam did like, say, like 70% of the work of making it like it's a legit debate between Carrigan and Gla1ve. I think Zonic then going and winning without Gla1ve is what's made so many people finally come over to the Carrigan side and be like, actually, maybe he is the best. Maybe, no, because what they've kind of realised now is, because you've seen the piece-by-piece A-B testing of Zonic in Astralis, Zonic without Astralis, not in Astralis, but Gla1ve there. You've seen device with Gla1ve, you've seen device without Gla1ve. When you start to see these, it just erodes a little bit of the notion, not that Gla1ve was the best, but it just makes him seem less like imperious. It makes him seem less 10 out of 10 in every area. It makes you think maybe there were areas where these people helped him. By the way, arguably the best at their roles. Remember, I have to stress this because people never put this in the convo when they talk about Carrigan and Gla1ve. It's like, bro, you're all then going to simultaneously tell me that like Device is the second or third best player ever and that Zonic's the best coach ever. Like, are we going to act like they're not involved in this equation? Meanwhile, if I go to Carrigan, it's like, I'm not talking about the best player ever. I'm not talking about the best coach ever. Like, that's not even part of the discussion. And then the last thing is, even though he has nothing to do with any matches we're talking about here, the actual unexpected benefactor could indeed be Snappy. Because, bro, before ENCE, we all know this guy essentially, like, his career was like John Travolta before Pulp Fiction. He was nobody. That was the comeback. That was what brought him back to the status. And in fact, that's why I've even been saying on Twitter, it shows you how crazy the speed of narratives, that as you're saying, people are for real having the discussion. Like, I don't think this Gla1ve guy can fill the shoes of Chex Notes Snappy. It's like, bro, can you even imagine any past year CS before 2021 where you could ever have said that to someone? Like, do you think Gla1ve could replace Snappy in a lineup? They'd be like, hey, what are you talking about, bro? Why the fuck would I care about Snappy? But the joke is, if Gla1ve joins this team and doesn't get big success, even though Snappy won't have done anything different, it'll make him look better. I actually think it'll raise his stock even further, because not only will he be off in Falcons doing whatever, but it'll imply he was the secret sauce to ENCE, which, if you notice, is the other part of this whole story, which is so complicated. Is I think a lot of people, quite frankly, despite what you said, I agree about the player strength being good, and they're all like, a bunch of them are like this close to maybe being in their career peak. There is a sort of feeling of like, shit, I hope it wasn't just Snappy and Saw doing all that though. And like, when they're gone, does this just become sort of like one of those bad mouse lineups, if you know, where it's like you've got a bunch of international players and you're all right, but you're not ever going to really win a tournament? Like, I think some people are scared of that, actually, dude. I mean, I get that like vibe that's lurking behind. I'm not as worried myself personally. To me, whenever I look at a team like this, I actually don't do what we're doing on this question. I remove all expectations. I just look at the lineup and go, right, what sort of like, how would you use this AWP? How do you use this rifle? And then I see the first games and see if that seems like it's making sense, you know.
Yeah, it definitely still feels like Snappy will inevitably win this sort of back and forth, because you look at, and of course, I love the point you're making about narratives, because you think about where he was before ENCE. He was playing on Contact, and that team was miserable. You had the various heroic lineups that were kind of okay here and there. They would get an odd upset, and it really felt as though Snappy was kind of just the heroic, or sorry, the Danish IGL that nobody really cared about. He was obviously in the conversation here and there, but he was never really kind of pioneering a certain style of play, or basically having a certain thing that made him very important in IGL conversations. But the fact that he was able to build this team piece by piece and then also bounce back after losing a lot of those pieces. You think about the Spinks to Nertz angle, which was always interesting, making the hard decision to cut Hades and bring in Senpaius. All of these roster moves look so mega looking back, that you move forward to Falcons, and he's going to assemble a team, and it's going to be exciting. And sure, he might have some, he has to have make some reservations here or there, but I think if you're Zonic, I think you could trust those moves pretty faithfully, just because of the track record that he's had on ENCE. So yeah, I think Snappy will actually sustain a lot to win from this whole conversation. And I think the other point that you're making about Zonic and Gla1ve is, yeah, the coach IGL duo conversation has become so much more prevalent nowadays just because of the amount of changes that have been happening to Vitality when Apex and Xtaz were playing for so long, and you were having this big conversation of, oh, can Apex really win without Xtaz after they switched towards that Danish core with Zonic, Dupree, and Magisk? And you were like, yeah, maybe it wasn't really Apex being a good IGL. Maybe it was just Xtaz being able to win. But now he's been able to do it with both of these coaches. He's been able to do it with Xtaz back into the role as well. So now Apex's stock is completely lifted as well. So now there is an opportunity again for Gla1ve to do it with, mind you, still a very capable coach. I'm not going to say that Cuban isn't a capable coach, but he's a very different type of coach. I'll say that much, because he's very he is a player that, or sorry, coach that likes to build a team bit by bit and make hard roster moves and really try to be hands on with this team. And for Gla1ve, he's going to have to basically to deal with a very different philosophy and a different system altogether. So again, it comes down to that adaptability. But working with Cuban is not the worst decision in the world. He's definitely coming into a good system, even in the coaching staff department, and he has an organization that helps him as well. So all of the kind of game is in Gla1ve's court at this point. It's just a question of whether or not he can actually open the pickle jar, as it were.
Right, let's go to your next question.
Sure. I think at this point, we haven't really had a podcast episode between CS2's release, so I feel like this is a pretty encapsulating conversation about the game's competitive health as it is right now. We've gone through, what, 4 or 5 lands, 3 or 4 lands at this point. And it's not too much of a sample size, considering some of these tournaments were pretty small in terms of the amount of maps played. But I think we've got a pretty good enough sample size to at least tell where the game is headed now that we've been able to play with MR12, we've been able to play with those longer smokes, and just with those new mechanics and everything. What do you kind of feel that the game's competitive health is at right now? Because to me, it feels as though there is definitely a shift that is happening right now with how it's being approached in CS2 as compared to the end of CSGO. And do you think these changes are good for the game? Is it important for the development? And if not, if you're not happy with it, what changes would you have liked to make instead to potentially prevent these changes to ruin the game, as it were?
The problem I have with this topic is, right, there's one that you didn't list off there among all the changes, which is like you mainly listed like max rounds and smokes and round time and all that. Like the actual one that obviously was the initial big complaint, it's why Simple doesn't play CS2 as far as we know, is obviously the AWP, right? Now, obviously, they'd already essentially soft nerfed the AWP at the end of CSGO anyway. Everyone forgets that when they put the clip size to 5, the mag size or whatever, and obviously like they hadn't changed any other factors. They hadn't put the kill reward up. They hadn't put the price down. Essentially, it was just a worse version of the AWP at the end of CSGO. As far as we can tell in CS2, look, if you actually are the absolute god player, like if you're some Monacy fit, you can still be really good, but you can see that it is a slightly nerfed weapon. Or maybe you could say like the balance between rifles and the AWP it's much closer, whereas it did seem in CSGO, if you were very good with an AWP, it's why, if you notice, this is the difference. In most discussions in the past of Simple and Zero might rifle a bit, or the classic one is when Nico wanted to AWP or Shocks, you notice even when it's Simple and Zero, most of us said like I can get why you might want to do it, but if you can, it'd still be better if he was on the AWP though. You can just have more powerful. I actually don't think in CS2 that's the case. In CS2, it feels like at the moment it is much more like you can choose. Like you can see, even when Zero wins this MVP, his numbers aren't that much more crazy than Elysia's, and Elysia's a rifler. Like actually, rifles do seem, by virtue of the fact the AWP is not as strong. It's not that they have actually been buffed, but they are stronger in terms of like overall impact on the game. And so I do think that part, that's not actually the end of the world for me right now. I still want to see basically like how do the AWPers that have kept playing the game, Monacy, Sunpat, how do they do if we give them 3 months? Maybe it actually turns out this is just more of a balance. And the point now is this, I think this could end up being cool, is now if at the end of the year, someone like Nico really does play like 10 out of 10 level CS for a rifler, maybe he could be number 1. Like, the obvious names right now is maybe Rops and Elige. Look, I don't know how they're going to do the top 20. I imagine they'll probably count CSGO as well. But if there was only a CS2 top 20 this year, we began at IM Sydney and it began from there. Dude, the joke is Elige and Rops would be your front candidates right now. Like, yeah, Zero's going to catch up maybe, but right now they could be number one. That hasn't been the case in CS since Cold Zero, if people don't know. Like, even when Nico was unbelievable in the years of Simple, and it was never going to be number one because, like, just the way that the game worked, the stats worked. I've always said this as well. Not only do I think the rating is mega skewed, because if you don't know, I think it over prioritizes survival, but I've always said this, because of the fact an AWP is such a binary kill or don't kill weapon, you tend to just survive a lot more as well. And obviously in the modern day, you save because the gun's expensive. So I've always thought, unfortunately, like, even though, yes, the eye test says Simple is playing better than Nico, the difference was, there was years where, like, I mean, people know I did this. In 2018, I had Nico over Device. I don't care that Device won everything. He was really good. I think Nico was unbelievable what he could do with a rifle back then. So I think that actually in itself, like, essentially on that one, I'm not actually sure if it's bad. On paper, part of me does feel like I wish the AWP wasn't nerfed, because I was always a rare person in CSGO who thought the AWP should be even stronger or cheaper. One of the two. Either make it stronger and make it worth the money, or make it cheaper and keep it like it is now. So I already had a controversial take. On the other ones, though, I'm actually not as big a fan. I think most of the other ones are bad. Like, for example, in MR12, there's a very big reason why I don't like it. And it's the fact that because you have fewer rounds, I feel like it's actually the opposite of what most people think. Most people would think, right, well, that actually means, in theory, that the T round isn't more of a premium. You've got to really know it. No one was wasting T rounds. No great IGL was ever going, you know what? Fuck it. I got, 15 of these things. I'll just chuck 3 down the drain for no reason. They were always, I hope you understand, guys, playing it like an NFL quarterback and trying to figure out, like essentially, like, how many downs have I got? How much time's on the clock? Like, how are they playing? You were always factoring these things in and trying to, like, economize and figure out how much, like, do I have to go for, like, the strat now? Can I, like, condition them for a few rounds? So I actually think it's the opposite. The real problem right now, and if you think of the final yesterday, this is a great example. In that final, in a normal MR15 game, if you scaled up the rounds identically, think how many rounds FaZe would have had after that T-half. That's almost like getting 10 T-rounds on Nuke, right? You'd never lose a game if you did that. You'd never lose a game. I know you might say, well, if I can get that many T-rounds, you can. No. The problem is, when you play MR12, the reason I bring up the Nuke example is I actually think Nuke's the best map to show this example. Now, even 1 or 2, like, individual players on T-side can win you a whole map. The whole map could be one of potentially one play. If you get the right play on the right round, that you're going to be broke if you don't win this gun round, and someone like Rops, so it's nothing to do with what Carrigan called, someone like Rops just wins a 1v2, you can now win a game of Nuke that you would be like, I'd say, like 1.5 times harder when it was MR15 and the old game. Then throw in the smokes. I also think that the smoke angle so far hasn't panned out for me. Like, at the moment, I actually think to some degree, what you've said earlier is what's tricking people. I do think the pace of CS2 is a lot frenzied and a lot more, and you see people, they are willing to do rushes, etc. Like, you're actually back in that world. So I think that's made people think the smokes aren't that big a deal. I'm so worried, dude, because when you get matches like finals, I'm even thinking of this game yesterday, I actually think some of the worst play in CS, even if you're hardcore, is when people sit on the opposite side of, like, a door or a wall where everyone goes to at the beginning of the round, and they just spam a smoke hoping to get a fluke kill. Like, for example, when people are playing Nuke and someone goes behind the metal door and then the CT's on the other side of the door somewhere, and all they do is each take turns opening the door, and there's a smoke there, and just taking turns to spam thing. I have always said that, look, that's terrible for a casual fan. You'd be like, what even is this game? But even if you're a hardcore fan, yeah, they're not doing anything. They're just guessing. They're just guessing maybe that guy's there and spamming it. It's why, by the way, I hated Vertigo when it came out and people just sat on that ramp taking, like, pot shot spams through the wooden wall. It's like, what is this game? Like, this isn't Counter-Strike. Essentially what you're doing now is, it's almost like some sort of fucked up Counter-Strike version of that slaps game where, like, you slap me and I have to dodge, and then afterwards I get a slap. Like, what are we doing here? Like, this isn't fucking the game. So I will say, I actually think the smoke one hasn't actually bloomed yet, as it were. I actually think people will see in a few months, I think that could get even worse. Like, my worry is that in games that slow down, it'll just make the game ass, because I think those smokes, dude, another controversial thing, I thought the CSGO smoke was very powerful. If people don't know, the 1.6 smoke was dog shit and it barely did anything. The CSGO one I always thought was too big, lasted too long, was way too dense. The CS2 one's even worse. It's even worse for that. So I have to say, I'm not actually a big fan of those things. With that said, though, I will just shade this in. I'm actually not particularly doom and gloom about CS2. I do think it is close enough to CSGO that most of what I enjoy about the game does translate. Luckily, it seems like most of the players that were good are still good, and the players that weren't that great aren't suddenly twice as good. There's rare exceptions. So I'm actually not that doom and gloom. But I will say, if we look at each thing in isolation, I do see a lot of negatives, personally. Like, I haven't really had any convincing like angles thrown at me yet so far, and why it's good, these things, you know. I even throw this out there. This is where I actually think people pushing back so hard on me about like MR12 and best of 5 finals does burn them. Which is like, that final yesterday felt like it never started. It was one team getting battered on map 1. Map 2 was almost, it was like, wow, we're about to get it, and then suddenly it was over. And the whole final was over like that. I don't think people have stopped to realise this, Paladin. We can accept that now if it's IEM Sydney or it's fucking this event now, like just some blast, right? I don't think people know what happens if the final of the major is like some really quick 1.5 hour, like 2-0 where someone wins 13-5 and 13-7 and then they're always leading. That's going to be garbage. It's actually going to be a bad match. So essentially, I'm not saying it's all bad. I'm saying I can see sort of paths we might be heading down I'm a bit worried about.
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head. So I'll start with the op changes because I hadn't written it down, but that is definitely a good point to bring up. But I think that I do like the fact that they're able to now shift the conversation a little bit more to rosters being built by rifle trios rather than an op. Because at this point, I did feel as though you had so many different rosters where you were like, okay, this team is very good. They have some decent riflers, but they can't win because they don't have a superstar opper. No, I don't think that's
bottlenecked by it, right? Yes.
Right, but I don't think that's necessarily the problem anymore. When you look at, I think the best example right now is Cloud9, where they don't have necessarily a dedicated opper. They have Boomich or they have Perfecto dabbling with it here and there, but they still look very good. They look very threatening. It kind of forces a lot of teams to take stock of how do we approach CS altogether. And it's created a new facet to Counter-Strike, which I am really excited about, just to the fact that teams now have to realize, yeah, I might just get wide swung on an angle here by a rifle or an SMG rather than an op, and that's just kind of how it has to be. And I do like that the tempo is much quicker now, because I do feel like at the end of Go, we had a little bit more of a chess match between a lot of teams with the way that people were defaulting. You know, you would deploy a couple of smokes on a specific part of the map, you'd take the control, you'd move to a different part of the map, you'd take control, and then you'd basically decide on a place to execute, and you would automatically execute. And you would take all of the time in each round down to the last few seconds, and then you would execute. And it was there was very few situations where you felt like there was a team that was pretty defined differently than another team. It felt like everybody was kind of playing the same homogenized Counter-Strike, which wasn't the most entertaining. It was definitely, as like a hardcore fan, it was exciting to watch because you could just see people really go to the extremities of playing Counter-Strike and kind of squeeze every last drop out of the game. But now I do feel as though they added in a little bit more of an up tempo to the game because of the wide swinging from the riflers, being able to pop open the smokes with the nades, allowing for, now map control isn't actually confirmed by anybody. It's just kind of half-heartedly taken. So I obviously think about the nuke outside smokes. Now you can blow that open and see a player cross through, stuff like that. And that's always very interesting. It creates a new dimension to it. It's a risk to run because you are potentially just creating a brand new meta that could just be rush-style Counter-Strike for a long period of time. But to me, I already feel like with what FaZe has done in CS and kind of pioneered with CS2, we've already slowly started to see that there is going to be a certain style to play the game for a little while, and I think we're just going to run through history very similarly how we did in Go, where I look at, NIP defining roles and then slowly people starting to realize, okay, this is how we play the game, this is how we use utility, this is how we use a different perspective of the game to our advantage, and you start to develop the game into a completely different game altogether. And so I think there's still time for these nades to potentially come into picture, and whether or not the peeker's advantage stuff is actually going to stay true, because the op has been getting a number of changes over a couple of updates, and I already think that it's feeling a little bit better. I I did see that during the fall finals, a lot of the oppers started to feel a little bit more consistent at the very least. I can't really say whether or not that's true because, of course, ZywOo was the one that was largely pushing that narrative. And ZywOo, so you don't actually know. He can't be the litmus test for whether or not a gun is viable or not. He's definitely an outlier in the situation. But I think on the angle of conditioning, that is probably the biggest gripe that I had with it. And when it first got announced, I was a huge stickler for it because all of the greatest IGLs are known for their conditioning, at least in the modern day, towards the end of Go. You look at an IGL like Kerrigan or an IGL like Snappy, who's gotten way better at it over the last few months of his time on ENCE. But on Kerrigan's side, he would condition, no matter what round that he would play, there was always a ulterior motive to it. He would rush basically out of a timeout, maybe on a first gun round or maybe a second gun round, and you'd think, well, why the hell has he done this? Well, he's poked and prodded and basically figured out where are these players playing initially before the execute comes. Maybe I can play with these rotations a little bit more if I slow things down and if I throw this bit of utility here or throw a Molotov there. And you slowly start to realize that he is slowly starting to figure out where every single player plays, what makes them tick, what their next decision is going to be, so that when that round 30 decision does come through, he makes it with such complete belief because he has basically figured out every little bit of how a team plays over those 15 rounds. And that can't happen if you just shrink it down to 12, because granted, you can't do all of those bells and whistles of figuring out where a player plays or how they play off of half buy rounds. And those you kind of have to have a bit of a gimmick strat. You have to throw a bit of a spanner in the works and hope that things work out. But on the buy rounds, you still have to kind of basically make do with what you have and basically figure out where all of these players are. But shrinking that down to maybe 3 or 4 less of those is really worrying to me, because you could already start to see it that Kerrigan didn't necessarily have that crazy round 24 play or whatever, but you could definitely still see he really knew how to mid-round call throughout the tournament, and he was still making some killer late game decisions. But you still never felt like he had that extra 5% that he could rely upon to potentially make that knockout blow. It never happened in that Vitality game, especially on Nuke, and that was, I'd honestly argue it, as you said, even with all the T sides that he was able to get, he wasn't able to get it on the he wasn't able to finish it off on the CT side because of a couple mistakes. And I'm not even talking any egregious one. It's like maybe a slight rotation here or there, and those mistakes happen. Those mistakes happen across all levels of the game, and even at the highest level. But the fact that they can't bounce back from maybe 1 or 2 buy round losses because of a slight misrotation or one whiff spray is kind of egregious to me. And I don't think that's necessarily fair to the best IGLs that we have in the game. So to me, I do worry about how the game strategically is going to evolve, because I think as far as the micro goes, I think it'll work itself out. Well, basically, we're already slowly moving back to how Go plays, but on a macro level, it doesn't necessarily feel as though we're in a very chess match game yet. It does definitely feel where we're very individually reliant. We have to hope that a player wins a duel and then you just win a round off the back of that. There isn't necessarily that kind of mid-round to late-round style that has evolved just yet. I think you're going to need a little bit time for that. I think the last big thing for me that I have an issue with is the fact that now that these games are shorter, BO1s are just ugly. They're just ugly CS to watch all throughout, because you think about the ramifications of losing a best of 1 nowadays, and you think about IM Sydney and the vitality that we had there where they played only 4 maps of CS. They lose 1 map to BetBoom. BetBoom wins a best of 3, and then they're into the playoffs. Obviously, that team has done nothing of late, and just having 1 good best of 3, 1 short best of 3, and 1 best of 1 should not be able to decide a tournament life for a specific team. And we didn't necessarily get to see anything from that Vitality lineup, and that's when everybody started to make these crazy gestures that, oh, ZywOo isn't good in CS2, or, you know, Spinks isn't good in CS2, or Apex isn't a good IGL. All these big, large, sweeping decisions and finger pointing were coming out. But at the end of the day, I think it just comes down to the format being very ugly, and I don't necessarily think that BO1s have any place in Counter-Strike anymore, just because as we've spoken about ad nauseum throughout this topic, there are so many situations where things could just spiral out of your control because you lost 2 pistols and you lost a buy round and the game's just done because you won a 50-50 pistol round on both ends and you had one gimmick strat on a buy round that worked out. So to me, I think that's the biggest issue is the conditioning that IGLs have, and then the BO1 ramifications. And moving forward, I think also in the playoffs, BO3s are just going to be slowly going to start to be very just meh. And as you said before, if you have a one-sided major best of 3, I want the major to be a best of 5, like completely at this point. Like there was a case that you were making that, oh, maybe you wanted to be a little bit pacier in Go, but at this point it just has to be long enough to be a considerable final, and a best of 5 just makes the most sense.
By the way, one thing I'll throw out there, 'cause it's a little teaser for people to think about, is the true irony of Simple taking this break is, bro, you will never have more impact individually than you could have right now. Like, the joke is, if you're someone like ZywOo or Simple, you can actually just win the whole game for your team because there's fewer rounds. Therefore, your impact, where you individually are the best player in the world at ringing hard, you can just win a whole game. Like, the actual, I mean, look, I get if you're Simple, like, it's not like the majors around the corner. You've got ages to go. But, like, you could have just, like, even if your Na'Vi team's flawed, you could have come back, and if you were the best player in the world, you might have just won all these tournaments. Like, Robs basically just did it. Like, he almost just won everything, didn't he, by being the best? So, right, we'll pivot now. Here's one of my questions. So, obviously, it ties into the FaZe one. We'll allude back to it, which is, now that the FaZe win streak is over, what do you think the significance of it was, and the fact that it's over? What do you think?
I mean, it was such a delight to watch the win streak unfold, just because of how it wasn't necessarily the most dominant win streak in the world. It was just very entertaining to watch. Every game was on a razor's edge. They were able to basically put in that big FaZe style on center stage, and every game that they won, even the very clutch games towards the ends of these tournaments that they were able to win, were just so impressive to watch altogether. But I think in terms of the actual significance of it, I will place a little bit more importance to it because it is the beginning of a new game, and I think there's enough differences between Go and 2 that I can say that it is a different style of play, and the game is going to start to move in a different direction because of what FaZe has done and how that they've decided to play the game. You could definitely tell that, as I was alluding to previously, is the game has gone to a much higher tempo, and that's not necessarily because of the mechanics per se. That's definitely it's definitely a factor to it, but it's the greater IGLs that are basically adapting a faster playstyle, and Kerrigan especially, that has been able to master that in a very short period of time, where the phases in his defaults are so much faster than they were before. And originally at Sydney, you were like, yeah, I don't know if this is going to work long term, because it definitely felt like everybody was trying to get their feet under them. But as soon as you started moving towards, obviously the online cups have a caveat in tournaments like Thunderpick, but Thunderpick, the CAC, and even in the fall finals, where that same kind of pace and the frenzy that they would add into these games were so important and caught so many teams off guard and was so sick to watch, that it does feel like all of these teams are going to start to kind of take note of that and realize that we've got to up the pace of our defaults as well. We've got to realize, how do specific players play in specific situations. People are going to continue to watch what has Rain done mechanically to get this another second, third wind under him to perform as highly as he does at this age. How has Rops just mastered this game out of the gates? How has he redefined what lurking is? Because as far as I'm concerned, I still think that there are people, even before, like in Go, where people started to question, I mean, is Rops really okay with this kind of play style? Should this be in the game? Should this style be rewarded in this game? And right now, everybody kind of just has to shut up and listen, because Rops really has figured out this game. So I think the fact that you have individuals that have mechanically figured out how this game should be played, and also on a macro level, how Kerrigan has figured out how to play on a more pacier style, I think this is. I don't know if I can necessarily draw the comparison to an NIP, but it does definitely feel as though a team that is pioneering how a game should be played, and how other teams are going to slowly start to follow suit, and we're going to slowly start to develop a meta based off of the skills pound for pound across the board for each player that there are on FaZe. And I can kind of feel like the roles are slowly starting to be redefined, and that is what I'm really excited about, is that we might have a new way to approach the game altogether, and come major time, a lot of these adaptations by FaZe could become just meta and a mainstay in World Counter-Strike.
The problem I have with this particular topic is it's actually quite a complicated one, because like on the one hand, obviously we've been through this twice in recent memory. Like obviously earlier this year, G2 had their streak they were on, then Vitality had their streak they're on, and now FaZe had a streak, right? Now the reason I bring that up is I actually think if you look in history, no one will remember the G2 and Vitality streaks like they remember the NiP 87 and 0, because it wasn't just that you had a streak, it's that like you were winning absolutely everything, including all the tournaments, right? And it's like part of it was like the dominance, whereas like those streaks came with like a couple of wins. And quite frankly, I do think, I'm just going to mention this now, the big problem is this: because CSGO was tiny when NiP had their streak, everyone was obsessed with the streak. I remember it was only like halfway in people started to notice, like, hey, there's like an actual, like, it's not that they just never lose, like, hey, the numbers getting up there, like, holy shit, like, has anyone even done this in esports? People look around, there's nothing comparable in any game, StarCraft, any of them, right? And so I do think that one thing that people have done a terrible job with for all these modern day streaks is just actually capturing the narrative. Like, dude, the broadcast, by the time it gets to the end of the streak is when they always start picking it up. They're like, oh, wow, now they're up to 15 or 16. And if you think logically, since like the max number ever was supposedly like NiP with 25 series in a row, which is different, by the way, from this match streak, because they said match, it includes BO1s as well, and online matches here. So, okay, but even so, right, if you have a streak like this, the problem is when you're in the streak and they're winning, it feels inevitable. So you think you've got loads of time to set the story up. You don't. Remember, the second they lose, it's over. So you actually have to treat it like this very special, like fleeting moment and really capture it. And I think, unfortunately, the broadcasts have done a terrible job, and they always have. Like, not only did they not really actually emphasize until the end the G2 and Vitality ones, think of some of the other streaks the Team Liquid won in 2019. If it wasn't for me endlessly going on about that, would people even know? Dude, the team won 22 series in a row. I don't think people still to this day are aware that, like, that's the second best streak in the history of CSGO, and now CSGO's over. It was never beaten by even Australia, and none of those teams ever did that. It was only NIP at the very beginning. Then, as you said, the problem with the FaZe one is already you've sexed the number up by putting Thunder Pick in, guys. Like, NIP was 100% on LAN. Now, I will say, there's still fucker in the NIP one. I did do a video about this once upon a time. Like, for example, the first tournament that's counted in the NIP one is like a Swedish LAN right when CSGO came out. That includes teams, by the way, that you've never seen these players on. So, like, you have essentially padded the record out the gate, but that's still LAN. That's different from an online tournament, is my point. So they did oversex the FaZe one. Here's where I actually think, though, the streak was not only good, I do actually think it was important for CS2. So I'm going to make an interesting point here that you have to know a little bit about the beginning of CSGO. So when CSGO came out, what's funny is people who are more modern, like, what was the year you started following CSGO competitively? What would you say?
2016-ish.
There you go. Right, so people who weren't around for the 87 and 0. What's funny is everyone now thinks back very fondly and thinks how legendary, and people like Get Round Forest must have been so revered. Believe it or not, cause CSGO the game, this is why I'm going to draw this parallel, at the time it was on uneven ground. People thought maybe it won't be a big game, and obviously all the 1.6 and Source players are flaming it and saying it's shit. By the way, anyone who'd played the betas knew it was pretty bad, it was pretty rough. The perception at the time actually was, will this even be a real esports game? And more importantly, Paladin, is it real Counter-Strike? Like, if it's got all these bugs and all this shit in it, and you see players like Tracer like half as good, you're tempted to go, it's the game, not the players. The game's just shit. So I always said, right, here's what's funny. At the time in esports, there was a lot more sort of like centralization of discussions about esports. Like, this might sound weird because you'd think, what would the relevance be now? But this was how it was. Back then, there wasn't much media. And so you'd have like general esports shows, like talk shows, believe it or not, that were like all esports, like Live on 3. Even though to me that's a crazy concept even then. So they would actually get a show, no joke guys, where as part of the show, one segment will be like an interview with Rafa in Quake, then we go and we interview like Idra in StarCraft 2, and then we interview some guy from CS. And I've always thought, there's not, like, the joke is, aside from like me and whoever put this show on, what's the target demographic of this show? Like, bro, nobody watches Quake and Counter-Strike and StarCraft. Like, that's like me and 4 people, like I say. So I always thought it was weird. But the reason I bring this up is because at the time, it was sort of treated like these sort of like Skip Baylor, Stephen A. Smith shows of like, these are the big narratives, and they're sort of debating them. And believe it or not, the popular narrative on these shows, Slasher was the main guy pushing it, was the idea that it was bad that NiP was on the streak. They actually said it might kill CSGO and it's killing the game. I disagree completely, and I think history has borne out that I am right. Believe it or not, Paladin, the reason why I think win streaks at the beginning of a game like this are very good is because of who is doing the winning. Since that was Get Right and Forest, who were the best 1.6 players right before, it actually gave credence to the idea, obviously skill does translate. If you were good at one game, you could be good at another, and it almost implies it must be a good Counter-Strike game because we know these guys are all-time great Counter-Strike players, and they're awesome. Similar scenario, we already know the FaZe clan players were mega. They were the best team of the last year and a half. That it's them coming and winning, I actually think, by the way, has undercut a lot. That whole thing that Simple did, that grandstand move, like, I'm just going to sit out and I would even recommend other players don't play. I think he's been undercut now, dude. Because here's the problem. Now, by the way, already because of Rops and Elige, but now because of Zero, now it just looks like Simple's the crybaby. No one now is going to look at the game and go, yeah, the game is trash. They're actually just going to go, wait, when are you going to play Simple? Like, they're all okay with it. So I actually think FaZe specifically, even being the team, is comparable to like having Get Right and Forest. Like, I think it's actually implied to people, hey, if Rops and Carrigan are the best in this game and they were the best in CSGO like a year ago or whatever, there's got to be something to CS2. It can't be total shit. It can't be this flawed, can it? Like, otherwise it kind of be pretty coincidental that like the same players can dominate this game. So I actually think it's very good for it in that sense. I do think though, to just end on one note though, I just wish the broadcast, like I say, understood how fleeting these things are. Because if you don't get that moment, like I said, now that it's gone, no one cares anymore. Like from now, once the next tournament begins, that storyline is literally, it's evaporated, it's gone. It was there the day before, the day before the final, it was right there. If they'd have won it, by the way, it would have been an awesome story going forwards. In fact, if anything, the one thing I have a complaint about is, I feel like if it could have lasted one more LAN, it would have become something really special and actually you could have really blown it up. And by the way, that alone, like the NIP one, it's also, by the way, low-key, a reason for people who don't actually watch CS to keep tabs on it. Like, when NIP was like 67 and 0, I'm going to say, people were checking in, like, oh, they won another event. How many is that? Like, add like 8 to that, like, you know, like, they weren't sort of doing that. It was a reason to actually care, like, about the development of the game. Whereas, this is why I say I think I was actually proved right. Because if instead you went back, Paladin, and you made the beginning of CSGO so that NIP doesn't win every tournament. So, here's what could have happened, right? Maybe Very Games even win that opening DreamHack Valencia. Then maybe NIP wins that DreamHack Winter, and then I'll keep some other teams. Maybe Gla1ve's Copenhagen Western Wolves team could have won an event. Maybe Very Games obviously was right there. They could have won an event. If instead it's like I win an event, you win an event, they win an event, the French win an event, the Danes. I actually think it's the opposite, dude. I actually think that is when people think, the fucking game's random. Yeah, there's no skill to this. Like, what the hell? Who the hell's Gla1ve? I was in 1.6. He's nobody. He's not better than fucking exist. They would actually be the opposite. They actually would actually undercut the game. So similarly, dude, just think now, if IM Sydney was won by Complexity, and then Thunder Pick was won by Virtus.Pro, and then now Vitality won this event, and then the next event, FaZe fucks around and wins, people could just go, CS2 is just nonsense. In fact, by the way, they'd all be flaming all the things we just discussed. They'd go, it's a bloody rule set doesn't let you be consistent. Like, the irony is, you notice also, by the way, this is why you can't draw, like, hard and fast conclusions from results, because it depends what angle you're choosing to take. Like, I could take this, I could actually argue if I was evil that MR12 is obviously better because, look, FaZe was more dominant, so maybe it's better for IG. I could do that if I wanted. I'm not going to do it, but you get the point anyway. So I actually think low-key, even though it wasn't particularly sort of focused on, I don't see any downside to this streak. I actually think it was great for the opening of the game. And to me, it has actually sort of given a level of underlying legitimacy to CS2 that I don't think would have been there. Like, if you saw any of my shows before IM Sydney, I think I was right, like you said. I predicted, actually, this might be what causes players to, like, rise up against Valve. Because I said, dude, you're going to play your first ever time officially in a brand new game with all these bugs and smoke problems, and you're going to bloody Australia, and if you go out last place, you fly right back after potentially 3 maps if you'd have just lost them all. Like, I remember thinking, dude, if you know what pro players are like, some of these guys are going to melt down. Like, I actually think this has been somewhat saved by that. Now they can't complain too hard, because as I say, someone can always turn to Apex and go, Carrigan's not having a problem with it, mates. That's actually pretty powerful for sort of keeping people in line, I think.
Yeah, no, it is actually incredible to realize that now people have to take the game seriously. And I already see that the community shift is slowly starting to happen. Every patch notes that comes out is being followed pretty attentively and being accepted very with open arms. And that, I don't think, there's obviously a lot of factors as to why the community perception has changed so much, but that is a very big one as to why. And you think about I will draw the comparison to Valorant, right? And when they started out their tournament circuit, you had every different team winning every single big
Right.
championship there. And I'll be honest, I had that very same thing that I was like, this is not a legitimate esport. It doesn't really feel like this game is legitimate. It feels pretty random. Any team could win. There is no best team, and for that reason, I was kind of out. Obviously, now you start to have some more legitimate claims that there are better teams. But the point being is that I never really was so swayed over to Valorant, particularly because the esport was just so quote unquote random. Granted, if I gave it a little bit more thought, it probably wasn't random. There was probably considerable reason as to why it was happening. But as a newbie, I just didn't really feel like I attached to it in any sense. And I think it is a very similar situation here in CS2, where we have an opportunity and a very watershed moment for a lot of new players that maybe dipped off at the end of Go, or maybe just stopped playing altogether, and and see this new shiny toy of CS2, and they're like, hey, maybe I should play it, maybe I should get into it. Players that are trying to come back from Valorant, or even from the early days of Go, excuse me, and they are now poised with the decision: should we play the game? And you look at a team that has been able to actually win time in and time out, and now you have the motivation. You say, "Oh, this team is able to do it." This is also a team that, mind you, was kind of falling apart at the end of Go. Like, they had that huge year, but the final few months of Go, they weren't that incredible. It felt like, okay, yeah, sure, this team is still very exciting. They have some exciting series here or there, but they aren't able to win too many trophies here or there. And it definitely feels like a flash in the pan, and that they're running out of gas. But as soon as they move over, they get that motivation to reignite. And I think that kind of story of motivation, the rejuvenation of all these players that now could be fantastic players in any sort of new roster that they set their minds to moving forward beyond FaZe. It's going to be so big for a lot of these players to potentially move over from a different game like a Valorant, or somebody that's retired to come back, or maybe you get an exodus from North America to come back with teams like Complexity also succeeding. So I think there's a lot to love about these initial winners of CS2, and it's just going to, as you said, legitimize the game. And I definitely didn't think about it in that way. That at this point in time, it's so important to actually have that sort of a win streak to bring teams more motivated in heading into that major cycle.
By the way, here's also the counterintuitive upside as to why it's also cool. Obviously, I love it when streaks continue with history. Here's why I'm glad it ended, though, because it would be a nightmare if the streak only ended because Twists went to Liquid. Yeah, that would be the real. Yeah. In some ways, it's a blessing that it just ended now. We don't have to worry. Like, imagine if they just won every tournament, never lost the best of X, and then he was like, "Bye, guys." Like, that would be. Even though we said earlier, like, for all we know, maybe it is knowing that it's the last dance is what's letting them play so free. Part of you would still always wonder, like, but would they have? When would they have lost all that? Like, but now we don't have to worry about that. That's all by the by. It's your turn for your last question.
Yeah. So I think at this point in time with CS2. A lot of roster moves are happening that don't necessarily feel like a plug-and-play roster move, where it's like, oh, this player plays this specific role in this specific position, so therefore it's a slam dunk move. It's a lot of the times it is a younger player coming into a new roster, or a more unproven talent that's coming into a roster that is being brought in particularly because their mechanics are good, or they have a good way of seeing the game. And it really begged the question for me, where I think about, do we really even have roles right now in modern day Counter-Strike? Because you can definitely say that specific players have defined a way to play. Like a player like Rops is a very slow, methodical player that will lurk a lot of the times on the map, will be the last of the bomb site, will have a flank here or there. But there are a lot of players in international Counter-Strike that don't really have a set, defined way of playing the game, as we maybe did in 2018, or you keep going back, 2016, 2014. So how important are roles now in modern day Counter-Strike? And of course, we can continue to compare and contrast them between different eras of Counter-Strike to kind of get a bigger picture as to what we think of it right now.
I mean, obviously, it's a very open-ended question, because to me, it's more like you're asking sort of like, you could even take the word roles and say, make it like rules. Like, are there defined ways certain players have to play in the game. I would say in general, this is one of the areas where if you've watched my content, people will know that there's many, many times you'll see me do talk shows or interviews where if I even broach this topic, because I'm famously one of the people who's mapped a lot of the concept of like what roles exist or what team structures, a lot of players think I am the guy who believes like there is a job of like he is the support player and that means he throws the flashes. He is the entry, so they think they do that straw man to me, right? They think that's what I think. But what they don't seem to realise, which if anyone's watched my content, they will know immediately then follows, is actually that was never my take. And in fact, actually over the years, I actually think we're all saying the same thing. It's just people are using different language. So basically to me, I think the roles are more like, there's two ways I always model it. One, I took this from Dota and League of Legends, but it's just the concept of finite resources. So in Dota and League of Legends, the way that your character gets stronger primarily is by killing the creeps, the minions, farming up the neutral thing, right? In that scenario, obviously, there are only so many minions on the map, right? So if you want someone to get really fed, you might have to give some of your minions to him so he can farm them. So the idea of essentially like in a team in Dota, they actually did do their roles based on essentially in the original meta, who needed the most farm. So the idea was the number one position is the carry position, number two is the mid. They're the players that typically need more farm. But the reason why I use this model is because, one, you actually can use it for CS, because the notion becomes, if you think of what I just said about Dota, well, obviously, then I can't make a team in Dota where I have like 3 players who would all want to be the number one position and get the most farm, because 2 of them aren't going to be getting it. And for the third guy especially, he might be up shit's creek. Maybe his whole style in this analogy is to be the main carry, and I'm not giving him the resources to be the carry. So essentially, to me, it's more an idea of how do we divide up the resources a team has, and then how do we recruit appropriately so that we're not recruiting 3 players who need all the minions, as I just said in that example. So what I would say is this, is if people don't know, you already in Dota got exactly what we're now going to talk about, which is there aren't really just set roles that only ever play that way. Like even this concept of farm in Dota, things like the third priority position is the off lane, and there are off laners, Paladin, who actually would be farm heavy. They would be a bit greedier. There were off laners who were very sacrificial and would essentially play more like a supportive player and just make sure all the farm went to the 2 main carries. And so you already saw there's wiggle room. It's like I say, it's more like you have this big pot of resources. How are you going to divide it up? So if people think of CS, the analogy goes, if I have simple and then some not very good players, or the best ones, the Zero lineups, obviously I'm going to put most of my resources into Zero or simple, aren't I? And then some of the other players might essentially, there's teams that Zero and Simple have played on where it sometimes felt like it was 3 or 4 supports and a superstar player, and the superstar was so insanely good, if you really did sort of funnel all the resources into them, maybe they could carry. The analogy in Counter-Strike goes, look, we don't have gold in the same way, we don't have a set thing, but there are still resources. For me, resources are things like utility. Do you get utility thrown for you? Do you throw the utility for someone else? Space. People understand this concept finally because they get it in terms of the entry player. Like, obviously, superstar player, I think you could look at Config's career and see this. Spoiler, whenever in Config's career he's not very confident, he's actually willing to be the first in. And spoiler, his numbers drop off a cliff. Because in someone like that, if they're second in, is going to clean up. If they're just going in first, they are actually that against a brick wall. So to me, I do think essentially they are important, but it's more as a framing for these sorts of discussions. So to me, the reason why the roles are interesting is if I say a player's a support player, what I mean is he's a player who doesn't get the resources, or he has to use his game to emphasize resources into a different player. And so if you ever notice, when I do have these discussions with players, when I explain it like that, they all pretty much get what I'm saying. I will say the one area I do think this whole role discussion was important, and the idea, crucially, the most important principle is the one I said before, that there are a finite number of resources, is because what's funny is, even if I did believe the strawman version, Paladin, that there's an entry and a support, and, you know, never the twain shall meet, and that guy always goes first, and this guy always throws it, dude, that would still be better than, in my opinion, the snacks way of thinking, which, if you've ever heard, is the idea there are no roles. Every good player can do any role, and you should just essentially recruit 5 players, then figure out how you're going to play. I think that would work way worse than even the strawman version of what I just said, because even if you did get a team and really just say, Paladin, right, my entries Yekindar and my support Zipnix and my opposite, I think that would at least function. I think my concept, even though I think it would still be very extreme because you're not allowing any wiggle room, you're not allowing any other setup, you're doing a very simple on the rails way of play. At least that could work. The difference is if Snacks really does go and he puts himself in a team with Nico and Coldzera and play, well, good luck. Good luck at that game. Good luck at your game with 4 lurkers, hoping they can all play all the other roles. Like, I don't think you're going to have a good time in that team, mate. In fact, I think if you look in history, most of the super teams that failed were like that. They were teams where it's like, essentially, you did recruit like 3 small forwards or 3 attackers in football, but in a team where you could only give enough resources for 1 and you just made 2 of them. Like, and this best example ever is probably that complexity lineup we all know where it was called Zero, Blame F and JKS. And it's like, bruh, you're all 3 the same player, or NIP now with Rollard and Rez and Config. It's like, what are we doing here? Like, we all know they're good players. By the way, I think these teams show that the Snacks angle can't be true because I know all those players are good. None of them are bottoms, but when you put them together, they're less than the sum of their parts. It subtracts from them. So I always say that famous line I took from the NBA because it's what they say in the NBA to explain why it's not strict in that. So if people don't know, like Tim Duncan technically is a power forward if you don't know, but if you look at his career, he plays centre and he clearly doesn't play like he doesn't just crash the rebounds, does he? Like, so in the same way, right, the line they say in basketball goes like this. They say roles were invented to explain the game to a layman. As in someone who doesn't know the game, that's just there so that you understand, right? The taller guy's probably the centre, he stands there. The small guy's the point guard who handles the ball. Like I say, the power forward gets the rebound. Yeah, that allows a casual to very quickly conceptualise what basketball is. Now, it doesn't matter that when he gets into it, like I say, they're not really as strict on the rules. Same thing in Counter-Strike. If you can say to someone, this player's sort of an entry player, or in the entry pack, this player's more of a look, I think that does a lot more than go, Snacks going, we're all unique children of Jesus who have our own roles and we can be anything we want to be. And like, I think if you do that, the difference is at the end of Snacks' thing, do you actually know anything about that team? Model are giving you at least sense of like the structure, who they prioritize, who they think. By the way, notice that's another interesting part. I'll just weave it at the end. Notice how my approach means the team themselves has to sort of be reflective and say, actually, who are we emphasizing? Who are we trying to play towards? Who are we going to give priority in these cases? Whereas if you notice, I can see why in Snacks' mind that version would work. I think you've got a million arguments down the line when no one knows who the star is and who's been sold. I think that's when you're in for a world of hurt, mate. So I have kind of a different take on that one. What's your take? Because here's the thing, I actually think this is a very wide open question.
Yeah, no, well, the main thing that brought this question to mind was I'm thinking about particularly the decisions that Vitality made to bring in Flames and bring in Mezzi, who traditionally do not play any of these roles in any sort of way, and yet still it seems to work. I definitely think that there's room for improvement in both of their roles throughout the fall finals, but they still managed to lift the trophy. And to me, I'm thinking from a GM's perspective or an Extaz's perspective as to why they thought that this signing made sense. And then I just kind of look back a little bit more and see other roster moves or other rosters that have worked that basically make this roster move make sense in their heads. So I look at kind of like what Bits different roles have changed, and he also feels a little bit out of place, at least on the Na'Vi roster. Now it feels like he's finally found his footing. He knows how to play the game. And then I'm looking at other future roster moves. Twist going back to Liquid. Twist on FaZe altogether after playing on Liquid, on that Grand Slam Liquid. He was a different player on FaZe altogether, and he kind of had to become a jack of all trades. He wasn't necessarily the flashiest player, but he would have certain entry pathings on certain parts of the map, but he'd be an anchor on other parts of the map. And so it was very interesting to see those players. That's kind of why I brought this question to mind. And so I was thinking like, okay, maybe we go back in different eras and we see how important those roles were to each team. And I think about the big eras. LG basically solidified using those roles a little bit more to a T. You could kind of see round to round what every player would do round in and round out. And you could basically figure it out if you were a viewer as to what each of their roles were. And I think Astralis kind of took that one step further, realized that structure really worked, and they kept running with it. And then I think that when we kind of changed the dynamic was when Liquid came on the scene in 2019, and it just felt like that's when roles just. I'm not going to necessarily say that it just went out the window, but I think that the notion that roles were very set kind of broke apart at that point, because it didn't necessarily feel like any one player on that roster had a specific role. Sure, you had Nitro opping in certain situations. Sure, you had certain players entering here, like Sui making space for the team. But you would have Elige entering certain times. You'd have Twist entering. You'd have Elige clutching. You'd have Naf clutching. You'd have Elige anchoring. And all these different kinds of positions that Liquid were very fine with, but they had put in so much time strategically that they realized that we can play positionless Counter-Strike and get away with it. I think, granted, there's not necessarily a roster that followed up in that same sort of suit, but I think they definitely took bits and pieces of that idea and said we can make a lot more rosters now just based off of is a player mechanically skilled enough, and are they intelligent enough to kind of work with work in the confines of a specific position or role. So I think about the MOUZ roster that was built up in particular. When you look at the NXT roster and you look at the players that were playing before they were on that roster, they weren't necessarily cut from that specific cloud. Zertian wasn't necessarily an entry. Yeah, you had Torji, who was a very aggressive opper on Budapest 5, but wasn't really that aggressive on NXT. And then, of course, Yimfat came later down the line. But all of these players had a very different style of playing, but they were very intelligent, very cerebral players that put in a lot of time in the game. And you could definitely see that they slowly started to create their identity. And then when they move over to that main MOUZ roster, everything made a lot of sense for them because they had finally found a way to adapt to the game, and they'd found that we don't have to necessarily play these roles cut out in our specific ways. Zertia didn't have to entry every single time. He would have Frozen to potentially entry for him on a specific part of the round. Yeah, Yimfat didn't necessarily always have to be the support player. There could be a situation where Shuhei is a little bit more supportive on the team. So to me, I think the pinnacle of where I think roles are at right now is that MOUZ lineup where all the roles are kind of guardrails. They're not necessarily a means of you have to walk in that specific line or else you will just lose. It's more so that you should still have resources being given to specific players and specific occasions. To use that MOUZ example again, Frozen is still the one that gets the most resources. More often than not, you see him have the best numbers because he is set in the star positions. But more often than not, there are situations where he does just take a back seat, where on like something like Mirage T's side, instead of him going in second or third, he'll be a lurker on the other side of the map, just making sure that nobody flanks them. And that isn't necessarily a star player's move, but he does it anyways to basically do it for the team. So I feel like roles in Counter-Strike have completely changed in that it's not really, to me, it doesn't really exist anymore. There are definitely players that I think that, okay, when I think about a specific player, I think that they are like this role. So I think about Rops, and I think that he is a lurker by and large. I think about, obviously, Device, he's an opper. But to me, I think now, slowly but surely, the roles are kind of shifting to something a little bit more positionless, and every player has to be aware of how every position is played, because you look at now the fact that there are more international teams are going younger, and there's so many players being churned out through FPL. Now every player has to suddenly just know how every position is played and be that jack of all trades so they can get that big call up. And so I think that I think teams and organizations are catering towards that and realizing that, hey, maybe we don't necessarily need to have a set way to play for every specific player, and that instead we can have a more homogenized view of how to play Counter-Strike, and we kind of play that through our IGL.
Right. Let's do the last question then. So this one, I will say, I actually did make this intentionally quite tricky, because essentially this is going to be one where, if you listen to the framing, I'm really making it like none of us can really know this. We are just guessing. It's just a shot in the dark. So obviously, as I alluded to in a previous one, right, for this year, my assumption is, unlike CSGO, where if people don't know, what they did in CSGO is they just skipped doing like a 2012 best players or whatever. That was like the 1 year they didn't do, because obviously half the year was like 1.6 and then roughly like a quarter or whatever. That's why it was scuffed, and some teams kept playing 1.6 and then some played CSGO. So I don't think, quite frankly, they'll do that, because, spoiler, they'd just be leaving all that money on the table, wouldn't they? Like, look, if HLTV doesn't do their top 20, they just don't get the traffic. So I think they're probably just going to do a combined one, if I had to guess, this year. I even think if you were going to do it separate and do half the year, you would have just done it when CSGO ended. So the fact they didn't implies to me they'll just combine it all for this year, say it's similar enough, and do it. So with that in mind, I made the question very specifically phrased this way. Predict a player who will be in the 2024, so next year's HLTV top 20. And then this is the key attenuator, who hasn't made it there. So actually what I've done is make this tricky though, Paladin, because that means, one, you have to guess who will make it this year and not pick someone, but then pick someone. So I'm sort of asking for a longer term talent, but who next year is going to bang out and make the list for the first time? It can be a shot in the dark, but who are you going for? What do we have a name that you're going for?
I think the safe assumption is a player like Donk, but I don't want to necessarily go there, because I think that there's still a lot of things that kid has to learn and a lot of playtime that he has to play on LAN for him to potentially just become that superstar. And frankly, Spirit are still a team that haven't been able to qualify for any big LAN straight up. So I think the first time we might see them is maybe the RMR, if anything. So there's some time for him to develop. So you have to look at more established rosters and look at the players that are on that one tier from making the top 20. And right now, to me, I think the player that feels like it could be a slam dunk is wonderful on Gla1ve right now, because I feel as though CS2 is made for him, and he's made opping look so easy. Granted, his first outing with Gla1ve was not the prettiest, but I think that slotting into an legacies style, where I think he's going to have to change up that system a little bit more now that it's wonderful, not simple. So I think there's growing pains there. But the mechanical skill that this guy has is so good. He just understands when he's being pressured, and he'll hit that necessary first shot. He'll fall back and he'll stay alive for a very long period of time. And I think that's just so valuable in CS2 right now, especially with how fast-paced the game is. Not to mention that his rifles are also just fantastic. That, of course, every roster will love to have an operator that can rifle, especially in this game in particular. So to me, I think that he's got the system to back it up. I think legacies has already proven that this Gla1ve system can work and potentially make playoffs and potentially go deep. Now it's just a question of wonderful piecing it all together, because we know the skills there. It's just basically the meeting of both the system and the player to kind of work out. But I feel, in terms of a risk, I'd take wonderful here.
Right, wait there 1 sec. I'm just going to double check. Right, here's what's funny is that actually would have also been like, that was the main name I had, but because there's like a hack to this, which is, that is pretty safe. Like if you've watched him play in Sprout, it looks like his skills, like the eye test checks out. But obviously, because he was on Sprout and he's only joined Gla1ve now, and the year's almost over, like he's just not going to be on this year's list logically, because like I think for HLTV, that would be pushing it. Even those numbers will look great. That's like a tier 2 player, essentially, or tier 1.5, yeah. And they're not really like that's not the same as, like, even on Spirit, they weren't that relevant on the circuit. So I do think that's a pretty safe one. Like, I think that's like one of the ones where you can be fairly confident. Aside from that, this is why it's a tricky question, because so many people are going to go on this year that feel like safe bets. Like, guess what? Spoiler, most of those ENCE players are on there. Like, of course, fucking Nerds and some Pious, like, you don't get any points for that. They're going to be on this year's list, aren't they? The problem becomes how questionable it is. Like, for example, one that I thought was on the fence, but is a good shout, is actually Torji, the Hungarian AWPer of Mouse. Because on the one hand, if you look, I feel like he's on the fence as to whether he'll get in the top 20 this year. Like he might if Mouse does a couple of runs at the end of the year. But if you look at where he is now, you look at his numbers, I feel like he'd be right around like the 20, 21, 22 sort of area. He might get knocked out because he obviously didn't do like that much. Like this year, obviously irrelevant to the major to some degree. So Wonderful's the safe bet. I think Torji, if he doesn't make it this year, I assume Mouse will be a good team. And if he's the AWPer, I assume he'll have to be good in that team. So I'll tell you what my hack one is, though. I had a hack one stored up secretly, which is, a lot of people won't know this, Dexter's never been on the list. And so since I know he's not making it this year, he is really good. Will he get a good team? I think that's a safe backup one too. I've done that as my backup as a sneak because like I said, I am cheating on that one because I test checks out. He just hasn't qualified yet, and he's not going to be on this year. So assuming he gets a team within the next 6 months, that's another player like Wonderful. I feel it's pretty safe that they could. I know they can do it. Whether they actually will, is by the by. But I feel like those are pretty good picks in terms of safety to go with. And I'll just throw this out there as well. It hasn't happened yet, but part of me just wonders. How can we have teams like Cloud9 and they're not even just thinking, well, we can't get that Monacy guy, Simple doesn't play, and then Shiro left. Like, when did they just pick up the phone and get Dexter, you know what I mean? Like, just get him, pop him over. If he's toxic, just make him play the sites on his own then, right? You play the B fucking anchors, see ya. Do that, make it work. There you go. I think that's pretty good, though. I just think we had some fair names. Because as I say, the problem is, this one's a bit tricky because you have to also speculate who will make this year's before you can know who didn't, and therefore it's eligible. So I think our 3 names there are pretty good. Notice they're all Orpas as well. Go on, give me another one.
I have one more name here. Yeah, I will talk about Virtus.Pro a little bit because I think the hype around that team is slowly starting to build. Of course, Maui's mentioned that they've only been doing well in online cups and they've been playing smaller lands, but I still believe in this Virtus.Pro roster, and I think they've really figured out how to play their style of game in CS2. And a player that I feel like is going to make that next jump is Flit, because I feel as though he's probably not going to make it this year. I don't think. He's had a couple negatives.
I don't think so. They also just haven't been that many lands this year. Remember, they're not in Blast.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So I think that next year, though, that's when things can start to pick up for them. And I think he's slowly starting to get in that territory of like a Yekindar style player where he is that talismanic figure that can start to win you games. And VP for a long time have been struggling to get out of specific scenarios where, they're in a 3v3 or a 2v2 and they just say, screw it, we're just going to save. But Flit's the type of player to break that stigma and to potentially bring you into a man advantage situation and potentially win you around. Whereas previously, I didn't feel like VP had that kind of player to look towards. I think Flit just developed so much that I think that he could potentially sneak in that at like a 20 spot, a 19 spot later on. But I'm not necessarily sure it's a definite. It definitely feels like a shot in the dark.
No, I think the reason why that's a good one, though, as well, is like, again, he's someone that checks out now, but crucially won't probably be on this year's list. That's the key for me, is he just won't make it because of the nature of the team. That's a good shout.